The thread of life began at the edge of the memory of rocks. As the first simple forms of life evolved, this thread started a journey along different lines of evolution. By the beginning of the Paleozoic era, the era of ancient life, elaborate and diverse forms were abundant in the oceans and inland seas. 100 million years passed, and animals with backbones appeared. While these first vertebrates were evolving in the oceans, plants led the emergence of life onto land. Another 100 million years passed. Land was still a frontier. Horseshoe crabs, animals along the invertebrate thread of life, began one of Earth's most ancient rituals, their yearly laying of eggs in the sands at the edges of oceans. At that same time, evolving from fishes, amphibians established vertebrate life on land. But the air-breathing adults still needed to return to water to lay eggs that would hatch into fish-like larvae. As epochs passed and plant life flourished, reptiles evolved from the amphibians, completing the transition of vertebrates to land. The pool of water, which had provided the amphibians with a womb for development, was replaced by an egg within a shell, allowing vertebrate life to spread across the terrestrial landscape. The Paleozoic became the Mesozoic, the era of middle life. Reptiles roamed the earth throughout this era, until suddenly their most majestic keepers of the thread of life, the dinosaurs, became extinct. The reasons for the great extinctions at the end of the Mesozoic remain a mystery. It is now the Cenozoic, the era of recent life, and there are again many species facing extinction, but there is no mystery. The human landscape is crowding them out. The story of the New Jersey Endangered and Non-Game Species Program's effort to protect some of the endangered reptiles and amphibians in the nation's most densely populated state is part of a growing effort to reverse this trend. Sometime between mid-December and mid-February, eastern tiger salamanders begin their yearly breeding migrations. Every year, these mole salamanders crawl out of their subterranean burrows, where they spend most of their terrestrial lives, to congregate in breeding ponds. This species has survived by returning before spring to the same pond from which they emerged as newly metamorphosed adults. These breeding ponds are disappearing or are being abused as humans expand into the landscape tiger salamanders have depended upon. Cape May and Cumberland counties are their last strongholds in New Jersey. The Endangered and Non-Game Species Program strategy is to establish populations of eastern tiger salamanders on protected public lands. But the adults have a homing instinct for the seasonal ponds where they originated. Moving them would not work. So during the salamander's breeding season, biologists search for and collect their egg masses, which are transplanted to a pond dug for them in a wildlife management area. Located within the salamander's natural range along New Jersey's coastal plain, the pond was dug to a depth where it will fill as the water table rises in the winter. It is important that the pond be shallow enough to dry out at the end of summer, preventing predatory fish populations from developing and then feeding on the defenseless larvae. Being in the open, the sun will warm the waters of the pond and begin incubating the tiger salamander eggs. The Endangered Species Program has also begun an experimental project to preserve a bog turtle meadow that already exists on wildlife management land. If left to itself, the marshy meadow would be overgrown by the red maples that surround it. In March, while the bog turtles are hibernating below, biologists enter the meadow to begin clearing the stands of red maples and other early successional plants that are beginning to overgrow it. Bog turtles are reptiles. Like all reptiles, they depend upon warmth from the sun. Once they emerge from hibernation, they need direct sunlight for basking and for incubating the eggs they lay in June. It is important to protect the areas where endangered reptiles and amphibians still exist. For most of these animals are unable to move the long distances to new areas suitable for refuge. It is also important to realize the danger that the surrounding human landscape might pollute the waters of their habitat. Amphibians are especially dependent upon the quality of water. The most critically endangered amphibian in New Jersey is the blue-spotted salamander. Its range is restricted to the Passaic River Basin, where the rapid expansion of development is destroying the salamander's habitat and poses a threat to the health and the level of their ponds. Early spring, when warblers are beginning to pass through on their migration north, is the best time to find blue-spotted salamanders, for the adults have emerged from hibernation to breed. The Endangered Species Program's first priority for the blue-spotted salamander is to identify areas where populations still exist in New Jersey. Once these areas have been found, the program can advise on the directions of future development to avoid harmful impact. The main distribution of blue-spotted salamanders ranges throughout New England, across to Minnesota and into Canada. The fact that New Jersey's salamanders became isolated from the core population to the north raises the possibility they are a remnant population dating back to the last glacial age when the Passaic River Basin was formed. As the weather warms and spring becomes a full awakening, bog turtles emerge from hibernation and bask regularly on the sedge tussocks in their meadow. They are North America's smallest native turtle and are easily identified by their head patches, which are usually orange. The Endangered Species Program contracted herpetological associates to undertake a mark and recapture program to learn more about the bog turtle's needs. When a turtle is found, it is marked by filing small grooves in a distinct pattern on the outer edge of the carapace. This does not hurt the turtle and will enable the biologists to identify individuals in the study population, and thus gather data on growth, longevity, and movement patterns when individuals are recaptured. This data will clarify the behavior and population dynamics of the bog turtle, which in turn will lead to a clearer understanding of their critical habitat. From this, better management plans can be formulated for the bog turtle's protection. Protection they need since they cannot hide from pollution or escape human encroachments. The Pine Barrens of New Jersey is a refuge for several of the state's endangered reptiles and amphibians. It is a unique ecosystem where a special ballet of life has developed around the natural acidity of its environment. Dependent upon the pure waters that flow from its interiors is a world of unusual flora and fauna. Probably the most eloquent spokesperson for the uniqueness of the Pine Barrens is the Pine Barrens tree frog. A study project was funded by the Endangered and Non-Game Species Program to probe the tree frog's niche within the ecosystem. Because of its amphibian inheritance, the tree frog depends upon the ponds of the Pine Barrens as a kind of womb which gives birth to its terrestrial stage. The first phase of the study project was to examine the factors influencing the breeding of the tree frog. Chemistries and temperatures of known breeding and non-breeding sites in the Pine Barrens were used as a basis for controlled laboratory experiments. It is during their developmental period in the ponds that the tree frog is most vulnerable. In one experiment, containers were prepared with varying amounts of acidity in order to study its effect on the development of tree frog eggs into tadpoles. In a similar fashion, tadpole growth and metamorphosis were compared. The experiments suggest that tree frogs are breeding in ponds which, because of the high levels of acidity, exclude other species of amphibians whose larval stage might compete with or else prey upon the tree frog larvae. By isolating the important variables, efforts can be made to identify favorable breeding sites and thus establish priorities for future protection. The second phase of the project was to learn more about the adult tree frogs by tracking their movements. In early June, the biologists went out at night when the mating calls of adults made finding the tree frogs possible. The Pine Barrens tree frogs are very small, and it was necessary to track them using a radioisotope rather than using a bulky battery-operated transmitter. Plastic tubes containing a small amount of low-level radioactive material were strapped around their waists. After the frogs were outfitted with their plastic belts, the daily vigil of tracking began. At first, the tree frogs remained close to the breeding pond, not moving more than a few feet each day. But towards the end of July, as the breeding season drew to a close, the biologists discovered that the 1.5-inch long amphibians are able to travel 300 feet in one day, and it was evident that further study of their migratory capabilities was called for. Knowledge gained by projects like the tree frog study is necessary to prevent the destruction of critical habitat in the Pine Barrens by development that is already eating away at its edges. New Jersey is on the forefront of the momentum towards an urban-suburban homogeneity that threatens our 20th century soul. We are learning, however, the need for the wilderness areas that still endure. Just as the tree frog speaks for the uniqueness of the Pine Barrens, the timber rattlesnake symbolizes its continuing existence as a wilderness. Although populations of timber rattlesnakes exist in the wooded hills of North Jersey, where they form a continuous link with populations in Pennsylvania and New York, timber rattlesnakes in the Pine Barrens are isolated from any other populations of their species. A tracking project was begun. The plan was to find 15 individuals from one population of timber rattlesnakes living on protected public land. Once a rattlesnake is found, it is carefully transported to a veterinarian to perform the surgery to implant a battery-operated transmitter. During the operation, the head of the snake is placed inside an anesthetizing chamber, an old mouthwash bottle. After the incision, but before putting in the transmitter, a long plastic tube is temporarily inserted to be used as a guide for the transmitter's antenna. The transmitter is implanted in the snake's lower abdominal cavity. It will continuously send a radio signal for the next 8 to 9 months, which can be received from a mile away. While the tree frogs and timber rattlesnakes were being tracked, the eastern tiger salamanders that had been transplanted as eggs during the winter were metamorphosing into their terrestrial form. They emerged from the pond seeking their woodland habitat, but were blocked by a wall of flashing. Traveling the perimeter, looking for a way out, they fell into collection pits where biologists would be able to find them. Daily, from the end of June until the beginning of September, the collection pits are patrolled for the emerging salamanders. If the colonizing strategy works, and these tiger salamanders return to breed in the pond, the Endangered and Non-Game Species Program hopes to dig new ponds in suitable habitats along New Jersey's coastal plain. The salamanders are counted and marked for future identification before being released into the woods, where they will spend most of their lives in subterranean burrows, feeding on small insects and worms. In 3 to 4 years, these newly metamorphosed adults will begin their first breeding migration. And because the tiger salamander program was begun 3 years before, the Endangered Species Program hopes that during the winter, the first generation will return from their woodland habitat to breed in the pond. As summer edges towards autumn, the eggs of the corn snake begin to hatch. Unlike its amphibian ancestors, the corn snake emerges from its egg ready to roam the terrestrial landscape. In their continuing effort to establish populations of endangered species on protected lands, the Endangered Species Program has a project where corn snakes are bred in captivity and released onto public land in the Pine Barrens. Corn snakes, like the other endangered reptiles and amphibians in New Jersey, suffer from overcollection. It is a serious problem threatening their existence. Corn snakes are part of the rat snake family. They capture their prey by means of constriction. It is not until their second full summer that corn snakes are capable of capturing and constricting adult mice. In the meantime, they will feed mostly on small fence lizards. The hatchlings are marked so that if they are ever found in the field, knowledge can be gained about their movements and lifespans. It is important to our human habits to protect species which are not endangered outside New Jersey. For if we decide that a creature is not worth saving, or wait to begin protecting species that are doing well in other states, when and where do we take action? By late September, the rattlesnakes have begun moving away from their summer hunting areas towards their place of hibernation, before cold days and nights no longer provide them with enough warmth. By mid-October, the snakes led the tracking biologists to a cedar swamp. With each new piece of information gathered, we are able to know sooner when something is wrong and act more effectively when trying to help. We are learning that as the human landscape grows, it encroaches on the habitats of other species. We are also learning that options are available to lessen the impact of this encroachment. At Collier's Mills Wildlife Management Area, in the northern part of the Pine Barrens, it was necessary to rebuild an old dam. In order to do this, snake mounds built 30 years before as places of hibernation for corn and pine snakes would have to be torn down. Using materials cleared from the dam site, new snake mounds were constructed at a nearby location. They were built on the north side of a clearing so that snakes, before and after hibernation, would have a good place for basking. The human ability to reshape the world needs to be guided by the human ability to realize the impact of alterations. If we take the time to look at the consequences of our actions, we see that our endeavors can coexist with, rather than ignore, the environment around us. The path of Interstate Highway 78 skirts the outside edge of a wildlife reservation where bog turtles live. The fate of this population of bog turtles depended on the design of the highway. To reduce harmful impact on the area, drainage systems have been incorporated into the design to reroute the initial polluting runoff from rainfalls around the bog turtle habitat. We are becoming more aware that the world is a complex interrelationship of systems, and our respect for the function of each species within those systems grows. Part of that respect comes from an understanding of what has shaped our present world. Each form of life today is an outgrowth of the continual transformations of the life that began in the ocean. Great spans of time and unfathomable numbers of events have shaped their strategies of survival. In each species there is a wisdom in its ways and beauty in its details. Beyond the growing understanding and compassion that argues for the survival of each species, we are beginning to realize that each success in preventing the loss of a species rebuilds our spirit.